In the summer of 1980, a small town in the southern United States became the site of a chilling and tragic crime that would reverberate through the community for years. It began when a group of white teenagers, influenced by the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface of the community, decided to take part in a horrific act of cruelty. Their victim was an elderly black man named Willie James Brown, known for his quiet demeanor and the few possessions he held dear, which he kept close to him in his modest home. Willie James was in his late 70s, a man who had lived through decades of hardship and struggle. Though he was no stranger to the indignities of racism, he had managed to maintain a semblance of peace in his twilight years. Living alone on a property that had been passed down through generations, he kept to himself, rarely venturing far from his home. His life, while not marked by wealth or fame, was one of simple routines: tending to a garden, occasionally going into town for small errands, and sitting on his porch watching the world go by. On the fateful evening of the crime, a group of 6 teenagers, some of whom had known Willie James for years, concocted a plan to torment him. They had been drinking heavily, and their minds were clouded by a mix of alcohol and the cruel ideas that racial animosity can breed in the hearts of the young. They were not entirely strangers to violence, but this would be the first time they turned their malice onto an elderly man, someone who had no chance of defending himself against their youth and strength. They made their way to Willie James's house, where he was sitting on the porch, unaware of the impending horror. At first, they approached him with mock friendliness, asking him about his life, as if they were simply engaging in a casual conversation. Willie James, ever the polite and reserved man, answered their questions, unaware of their ill intentions. The teens began by taunting him, calling him racial slurs and belittling his age and appearance. They mocked him for his old clothes and his humble life, their laughter ringing in the quiet evening air. Willie James, though he had faced this kind of treatment all his life, tried to ignore their jeers, hoping they would grow tired and leave him alone. But that wasn't their plan. In a sudden burst of aggression, they overpowered him. With their combined strength, they dragged him from his porch and forced him to the nearby woods. Willie James was too frail to resist, too confused to fully comprehend what was happening. The teens were relentless. They bound his hands with rope and pushed him into a shallow pit they had dug earlier. Laughing as they watched him struggle, he tried to plead with them, asking them to let him go, but his pleas were met with cruel jeers. One of them, in a twisted moment of thrill, began to bury him alive, shoveling dirt over his body with a nonchalance that sent a wave of horror through the air. Willie James, now trapped beneath the weight of the earth, fought for breath, his heart racing as the dirt filled his mouth and lungs. His cries for help were muffled by the earth that piled on top of him, and the weight of it seemed to swallow him whole. As the teens continued their sinister task, they didn't stop to consider the life they were taking, the agony they were causing, or the legacy of hatred they were reinforcing. By the time the sun set that evening, Willie James Brown was dead, his body cold beneath the earth. His life was extinguished without ceremony or justice. The teens returned to their lives, but the gravity of their crime would soon catch up with them. The community, stunned by the revelation of what had happened, struggled to comprehend the brutality that had taken place. It wasn't until a neighbor, noticing Willie James's absence and his unkempt house, grew suspicious and went to investigate, that the truth began to surface. The authorities were called, and after a search of the woods, Willie James's body was found, still buried in the shallow grave the teens had made for him. The news spread quickly, shocking the town. People who had known the boys could not believe what they had done, and families who had been friendly with Willie James were filled with grief and anger. The investigation that followed was swift. The teenagers, all of whom were under the age of 18, were arrested and charged with murder. The trial that ensued was a bitter reminder of the deep divides within the community, where racial tensions ran high. Some people in the town, unable to reconcile the horror of what had happened, tried to justify the crime, pointing to the teens' age and supposed lack of understanding. But others, particularly those who had known Willie James, were adamant that this was a senseless act of racial hatred that needed to be punished. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the focus shifted to the motivations behind the crime. While the teens claimed they had been drunk and didn't fully understand what they were doing, The evidence of their premeditation and the malicious nature of their actions was undeniable. The court sentenced the teens to varying lengths of time in prison, but no amount of punishment could undo the damage done. For the family of Willie James Brown, there was no closure. His death became a symbol of the racial violence that had persisted for generations, a stark reminder of the cruelty that could be unleashed by hatred and ignorance. And for the small town that had once been peaceful, it would never be the same again. The echoes of that night haunted the streets, the woods, and the memories of everyone involved. The story of what happened to Willie James was not one that could be easily forgotten, no matter how much time passed. The aftermath of Willie James Brown's death left a deep scar in the community. The small town, once seemingly divided by its racial boundaries, was now thrust into an uncomfortable reckoning with its own conscience. The murder had exposed the ugliness that had long simmered beneath the surface of the racial animosity, the sense of superiority some held over others, and the brutality that could emerge when hatred went unchecked. For those who knew Willie James, it felt like not just a crime against a man, but a crime against the very principles of humanity. His family, though devastated by the loss, found themselves battling not just the grief of his untimely death, but also the erasure of his existence at the hands of those who wanted to dismiss or downplay what had happened. For some members of the town, Willie James was just another black man, his death tragic but somehow not entirely surprising. Yet, for his family, he was a father, a brother, a friend, a man who had lived a life of resilience, who had endured unspeakable hardships, and who had deserved far better than to be treated like an expendable object. As the investigation moved forward, it became apparent that the teenagers who had taken part in the crime had grown up in an environment where racial hatred was commonplace. Some came from families that openly expressed their prejudices, while others had been influenced by the toxic attitudes that persisted in the community. These influences were never spoken of in polite circles, but they existed in whispers, in the way certain people in the town referred to black residents or the things they said behind closed doors. It wasn't just the act of burying an elderly man alive that was shocking, it was the casualness with which these teens had done it, as if they had been conditioned to believe that their victim was less than human, less deserving of life than they were. But while the town was divided in its reactions to the crime, there was one thing that became clear. The murder of Willie James Brown had awakened something in the community. People began to confront the deeper issues that they had ignored for years. Civil rights groups and community leaders from across the region took notice of the case, not just as an isolated tragedy, but as part of a much larger and pervasive pattern of racial violence. They rallied behind the Brown family, demanding justice not only for Willie James, but for the legacy of racial inequality that had allowed such an atrocity to occur in the first place. Protests were organized in the town square, with people from all walks of life demanding accountability and change. Some white residents stood alongside their black neighbors, joining in solidarity, while others retreated into their homes, unwilling to confront the truth of what had happened. For the first time in decades, conversations about race and injustice dominated the town's discourse. People were forced to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about their own biases, about the ways in which they had allowed racism to flourish unchecked, and about the long history of violence against black people in the United States. The trial of the teens was a spectacle that drew attention from outside the town. News outlets from across the country covered the proceedings, eager to capture the tension and emotion that filled the courtroom. The defense, arguing that the boys were young and didn't fully understand the consequences of their actions, presented their case with a focus on their troubled backgrounds. But the prosecution countered with the damning evidence of premeditation, the planning of the crime, the gathering of tools, and the way they deliberately went out of their way to terrorize and kill a man who had done them no harm. The public outcry grew as the details of the crime became more widely known. People across the nation expressed their outrage at the cruelty of the act, calling it a stark reminder of the legacy of racial violence that had yet to be fully addressed. For many, it was a breaking point, a moment when they could no longer pretend that such things didn't happen, or that they could be ignored as mere accidents of circumstance. As the trial concluded, the teens were found guilty of murder. The sentences they received varied, but none of them faced the death penalty. The verdicts were met with mixed reactions. Some felt that justice had been served, while others, particularly in the black community, felt that the punishment didn't truly match the severity of the crime. The idea that these young men would serve a few years and then return to society felt like a slap in the face to those who had fought for equality, for the recognition of black lives, for the right to live without the constant fear of violence. Willie James's family, though they had won some semblance of justice in the courtroom, were left with a permanent void. They would never be able to bring him back. His death had stolen from them the opportunity to care for him in his final years, to share in the small joys of life with a man who had lived through so much yet still carried within him the quiet dignity of those who had endured and persevered. In the years that followed, the community tried to move forward, but the shadow of Willie James Brown's murder lingered. It became a pivotal moment in the town's history, a turning point that demanded introspection and change. Some people began to embrace the difficult work of unlearning their biases, of making the town a more inclusive place. Schools initiated programs to teach children about the history of racism and the importance of tolerance, while local leaders pushed for greater efforts to reconcile and heal the community's wounds. But for all the progress that came after the fateful summer, the legacy of Willie James's death would never fully disappear. It had exposed the deep divisions in a community that had long denied their existence. It had forced people to confront the ways in which they had failed to protect one another, particularly those who were most vulnerable. And for Willie James, it meant that his death, while tragic, had given birth to a movement, a call for justice and for change that would continue long after the trials and protests had faded from the headlines. For his family, and for those who knew him, the memory of Willie James Brown would never be just about how he died. It would always be about how he had lived, and the dignity he had shown in a world that had too often tried to strip him of it. The years following Willie James Brown's death became a period of slow, painful healing for the community, yet the scars remained. Despite the passage of time, the events of that summer continued to reverberate through the town, woven into conversations, relationships, and even the way people viewed themselves and their neighbors. It was as if the town had been forced to confront a truth it had long ignored, and a legacy of racial hatred and violence was not a distant part of history, but a living, breathing issue that still haunted the present. For the Brown family, the pain of their loss never fully dissipated. They carried the weight of Willie James's memory in their hearts every day, yet they found strength in his legacy. His life had been quiet and modest, but his death had sparked a movement. They became vocal advocates for change, speaking out about the need for greater accountability in cases of racial violence. They worked with civil rights organizations to ensure that other communities did not face the same heartbreak, and they pushed for the expansion of programs that taught empathy, respect, and understanding in schools. In the years that followed, there were efforts to memorialize Willie James in the town. The local community center, once a place where children played and families gathered for events, was renamed in his honor. The walls of the building were adorned with photographs of Willie James from his youth, along with quotes that reflected his wisdom, kindness, and resilience. The town's mayor, who had been reluctant to address the issue head-on initially, eventually became a proponent of racial reconciliation, advocating for programs that encouraged dialogue between different groups in the community. However, not everyone embraced these efforts. There were those who resented the town's newfound focus on racial justice, who saw the memorials and the community programs as a way to open old wounds, and they pushed back against the changes. Some felt that enough time had passed, that Willie James's death was being used as a symbol to push an agenda that threatened the status quo. Tensions flared in town meetings, and for a time, it seemed as though the wounds might never heal. But the conversations continued. Slowly, some minds began to change, and a few people who had once resisted the push for justice began to see that healing could only come through acknowledgement, understanding, and change. Meanwhile, the teenagers who had participated in Willie James's murder faced the consequences of their actions in varying degrees. Though none of them were sentenced to life in prison, their lives were forever altered by what they had done. Some found themselves ostracized from the community, unable to escape the judgment of their peers. Others struggled with their own guilt and shame, trying to make sense of the violence they had taken part in. One or two of them, as they matured, came to understand the full magnitude of their actions and publicly expressed regret, though that did little to ease the pain of those who had been directly affected by the crime. The families of the perpetrators also had to reckon with the truth. Some parents attempted to distance themselves from their children's actions, unable or unwilling to face the fact that their own upbringing might have contributed to the hate that fueled the crime. Others, more introspective, began to grapple with the reality of the culture they had raised their children in, of the prejudices that were embedded not just in their own lives but in the fabric of the town itself. As the community continued to heal, the tension between the desire for reconciliation and the weight of the past persisted. There were those who wanted the memory of Willie James to remain a rallying cry for change, while others sought closure in the form of forgetting. The town's collective journey toward healing would be neither quick nor easy, yet, with each step, there was a sense of progress, a sense that, even amid the divisions, something better was slowly being built. Years later, as the anniversary of Willie James's death approached, the community came together for a ceremony at the memorial. It was a quiet gathering, marked by speeches from civil rights leaders, family members, and community organizers. The mayor, now an advocate for racial justice, spoke about the transformation the town had undergone, acknowledging that it had been difficult but necessary. There were tears shed that day, not just for the loss of Willie James, but for all the people who had been affected by his death, whether directly or indirectly. As the ceremony ended, a young girl, the great-granddaughter of one of Willie James's neighbors, stood at the memorial and placed a flower in the soil. She didn't know Willie James personally, but she had been taught about his life, his death, and the lessons it carried. She was growing up in a town that was slowly learning to understand the importance of empathy, of justice, and of standing up for what was right. Her generation would not carry the same baggage of racial hatred that had poisoned the hearts of those who came before her. They would work to ensure that no more lives would be taken by the same senseless violence, that the town's future would be different from its past. The name of Willie James Brown lived on not just in the memorials and speeches, but in the actions of the people who, through pain and loss, had been awakened to the need for change. His death, though a tragic and brutal moment, had sparked a movement that reached beyond the walls of the town, calling for a reckoning with the sins of the past and a commitment to building a future founded on justice and respect for all people. His life and death had become a symbol of what happens when hatred goes unchecked, and what can be achieved when a community comes together to confront that hatred, to heal, and to move forward. And though Willie James Brown was no longer there to witness it, his legacy lived on in the hearts and minds of those who chose to remember, to honor him, and to ensure that his story would not be forgotten. As the years passed, the town slowly began to transform in ways that no one could have predicted. In the wake of Willie James Brown's death, the seeds of change that had been planted in the wake of his murder grew, though it was clear that true transformation would take time, patience, and constant effort. The younger generations, raised in the shadow of what had happened, were beginning to form their own identity shaped by the lessons they had learned about racism, violence, and justice. Schools in the town, once predominantly focused on academics, began to incorporate discussions about social justice, history, and race relations into their curricula. Educators worked together to ensure that young people were given the tools to understand not only the historical context of racial injustice but also the ways in which they could actively challenge prejudice in their own lives. Community service programs flourished, with high school students volunteering to help repair homes in the predominantly black neighborhoods, planting trees in memory of those lost to violence, and participating in dialogue circles to foster understanding between groups that had been divided for generations. The story of Willie James was taught in classrooms, but it was not taught as just another tragedy. It became a powerful example of how deep-rooted hatred could destroy a life, and how communities could rise up to challenge it. Local leaders, many of whom had witnessed the transformation, began to speak out more vocally about the need for reparations and policies that addressed economic and educational inequalities. The town, for all its progress, still grappled with the consequences of its past, but more people now understood that healing wasn't just about acknowledgement, it was about action. Meanwhile, The Brown family continued to lead efforts to promote peace and equality. They spoke at national events and worked with organizations to raise awareness about the long-lasting effects of racial violence. Though the pain of losing Willie James never fully dissipated, the family found solace in knowing that his life had sparked something larger than the immediate grief they had experienced. Through their tireless efforts, they met with other families who had suffered similar tragedies, offering their support and advocating for the healing of all communities affected by racial violence. In the years following Willie James's death, the town held an annual memorial service in his honor. The event had become a symbol of the town's ongoing journey toward healing, where people gathered not just to mourn, but to reflect on how far they had come and how far they still needed to go. Every year, the attendance grew, as more people from neighboring towns and regions came to witness the transformation that had taken place. The memorial service had evolved into a reminder not only of the horrors of the past, but also of the power of collective action and resilience in the face of injustice. But even with the positive changes, not everyone in the town was on board with the shifts in perspective. There were still those who resented the focus on Willie James's story, who felt uncomfortable with the attention it garnered or the calls for reparative justice. These individuals, many of whom had grown up in a time where such violence was almost overlooked, had difficulty reconciling with the idea that they too, as a community, had to take responsibility for the consequences of the past. Tensions remained, though they were now often carried out in private conversations or whispered debates. The shift toward racial reconciliation was not universally accepted, and the process was not without its setbacks. Yet, over time, more and more individuals began to take responsibility for the town's legacy. A handful of local business owners who had once kept their distance from the issues of racial injustice became vocal advocates for community programs aimed at healing the divide. They started sponsoring scholarships for black students, offering internships to those from marginalized backgrounds, and contributing to projects that directly addressed the lingering inequalities in education and employment. It was not enough to completely erase the damage done, but it was a step in the right direction. As the town moved into a new decade, the lessons of the past continued to guide the future. New leaders, both black and white, emerged who were determined to create a town where everyone, regardless of their race or background, could thrive. These leaders understood that progress could not be achieved through mere symbolism or gestures, but through sustained commitment to building a more equitable society. They pushed for changes in local law enforcement practices, advocated for economic opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups, and worked to bridge the gaps between communities that had been torn apart by years of distrust and division. Still, the name of Willie James Brown loomed large in their hearts. The memorial to him was not just a tribute to a man who had died in such a violent and senseless way, but also a reminder of what was at stake if communities failed to confront the darkness that still lingered beneath the surface of society. His death had forced people to ask uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in systems of injustice. His life and death had created a ripple effect, one that was still moving through the town, changing lives in ways that no one could have predicted. The generation that had grown up after Willie James's death, now adults, carried forward his legacy in different ways. Some became teachers, some went into politics, and others took up roles in social justice organizations. They told their children about the man whose death had changed everything, not as a story of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of community, resilience, and the unyielding fight for justice. They told their children that things could change, and that no matter how deep the scars of the past, healing was always possible. Though Willie James Brown was no longer with them, his presence was felt in every effort to build a better, more inclusive future. His memory was alive in the conversations people had, in the actions they took, and in the values they passed on to future generations. The story of his life and death, once a painful chapter in the town's history, had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of the power of human dignity to outlast hatred and violence. The town, in its own imperfect way, had learned to honor him not through grand gestures, but through the daily work of ensuring that his death was not in vain, that his spirit would live on in the kindness and justice they extended to one another. And though it was impossible to undo the tragedy, they had found a way to move forward it together.